Hello, and welcome to We Are The Deluge, a spoiler-free chapter-by-chapter podcast about the climate change novel, The Deluge, by Stephen Markley. We are your co-hosts, Emily Crandall and John McMahon, two survivors of the CUNY Grad Center Political Science Department, theory nerd friends, using this novel as an excuse to hang out, podcast, and maybe co-author something, but we're not committed to it.
So true. I love it.
Today, we are discussing why we are making this podcast and why you should listen to it in the form of a prologue episode.
Absolutely. Key for the listeners, key for us to, get our sense of bearings of what's happening, help the listeners do the same. So I think what we're going to do, Emily, is we're going to tell the listeners what we'll be doing in each episode, a little bit of a sneak preview of some of the form of it. But instead of a chapter, we will explain why make this podcast, why read this book, why listen to this podcast.
It already feels so meta, which is appropriate.
Yeah. This is one of the more meta books I've ever read. So I'm
not
into it.
Not to cryptic foreshadow the podcast. But...
Right. So in every episode, we will propose episode titles for that episode. We're taking a page out of one of Emily's books, almost quite literally. And so I think if for the purpose of the prologue, we're going to talk about why the name of the podcast is We Are The Deluge. And I think it's because it's a phrase that appears in the book. So That's always nice. Emily and I view ourselves as like the deluge of podcasting, We wanted to make sure for SEO reasons to work the name of the book into the podcast title. Surely that's going to help us in the old podcast apps. And any other reasons why this is the name?
I think that it also taps into the sort of like we are the gravitas, right?
Yes, definitely.
We are the flood. We are the insert poignant commentary on the nature of human existence.
Yeah, absolutely. And I suspect that something else that's happening here is that both of us are political scientists by trade in our day jobs. And there's a little bit like political social movement-y language to it and the way that phrase will appear in the book. So I think that probably appeals to us on some like base level.
Oh, yeah. Oh, God, I don't even want to think about it. Why not at that base level?
And we're gonna work out so much of our like collective and individual like academia angst here in this podcast. It's going to be amazing and listeners are going to love it. But Emily,
that's a great segue, actually. The summary.
Please do go for it.
So the summary of this chapter of what we are doing. So basically, I think at its heart, this podcast is us trying to do a couple things. First, figure out the book. It's a huge book. I read this book on a recommendation. I have a friend who is not an academic, who's like a career service industry person who is a voracious reader. And he was reading this book a couple years ago. And the whole time was like, dude, you got to read this. I feel like he was like, I feel like I'm missing so much of this book. And already what I'm getting is it just screams you. And I read it and I texted our Always Already podcast chat immediately. And I was like, you guys have to read this book. It's bananas. Yes. I don't understand how a person wrote it. And we both teach similar stuff in political theory. And I think this podcast is a bit of our effort to figure out, I'm going to go meta here.
Of course, that's only fitting.
Like what it means to do political theory at the end of the world.
Yes, absolutely.
If I may. And like how to teach a novel when you're trained as a like sort of boring philosopher,
political scientist, like somewhere at the crossover of the two. Yeah. I think what this book means and what reading and responding to this book means is absolutely crucial to what we're trying to do, because it is a part of like, we can talk about climate fiction is about what does human agency mean in the face of climate catastrophe. And I don't know, maybe this podcast is a little bit of a way of us figuring that out on our own. Yeah. So I took Emily up on the offer. I read the book and then I finished it and thanked her for the recommendation immensely. And then I was like, oh, I should probably teach this book, right? And like Emily helped me plan that a little bit. And then I taught it and I was like, Emily, we should make a podcast about it. And here we are. We did it.
So in this podcast, we're going to go chapter by chapter through the entire book. It's 900 pages.
Yeah.
I hope you read it.
Great time.
Dear listener.
Yeah.
And the idea is that you could read along, or you could have already read it, or you could not read it and just listen to us talk about it.
Yeah. That's the like most galaxy brain view, but it's one I support. That approach works, I think.
So what else are we doing? Am I missing
we are not going to spoil anything. Yes, right? Emily and I have both read the book all the way through. We will podcast as if you are reading it for the first time, so you won't be spoiled. We'll drop some cryptic foreshadowing hints and be like, pay attention to this thing. This might come back. But we promise not to like straight on spoil anything. And I feel like having taught the book to students who are reading it for the first time, like I have trained myself in the art of cryptic, but not spoiler.
That's great.
I feel confident there.
I have a weird thing with fiction where once I finish it, I forget it. So
yep.
Yeah. So I have read it, but I sort of feel like I'm reading it again for the first time.
There's so much happening in this book at every level, like whether we talk about climate politics or climate ideas or plot or narrative or like form, all these levels. There's so much happening. Like this will be the third time I'm reading this book, and I have no doubt I will find new things that I've yet to discover. Sign of a good book.
Committing it to the record.
Absolutely.
So one thing we're going to keep track of, in addition to all the characters, which is a lot, are the sort of themes. This is going to be a major segment of each episode that we do in our chapter by chapter podcasting of the book. So I think just for the purposes of a prologue, for me, this book felt urgent and necessary personally, and also urgent and necessary politically. It starts in 2013.
Yes.
And goes to the 2030s.
Yeah, late 2030s.
It's incredibly well researched.
Yes.
I was shocked that a person wrote it when I finished it. Just, I don't know a better way to describe my sense of awe at the fact that it exists.
Yeah.
But also, what's so interesting about it to me is it's a climate change novel. It's a political thriller, but it's also like visceral and about so many other things. And it just felt like it deserved a really careful treatment of what is the relationship of all the other bullshit to the looming threat, quote unquote, of climate change, right? Like, and I mean threat, like in multiple senses, not like obviously. Threat, is it a threat? But
right, and multiple timescales as well.
Yes,
as this book is playing with, of course.
Yeah. So to me, the themes together and trying to parse out how they work was just like something I couldn't think about by myself.
Yeah. I love the idea that this is a climate novel, and it's extremely self-consciously a climate novel, right? This is not climate is incidental. Like this is, I am intending to write the climate novel, the climate epic, like of our time or something, I suspect, from the way it's written and some of the interviews that Stephen Markley has given. But I appreciate this point, and I think it's something we'll probably pay a lot of attention to, is this is a book that is interested in politics institutionally. It's a book that's interested in social movement. It's a book that's interested in addiction. It's a book that's interested in cancel culture. It's a book that's interested in gender roles. It's a book that's interested in race. It's a book that's interested in disability and neurodiversity. It's a book that's interested in secrecy. And it's a book that's interested in on and on and on. And there's a way in which that could be disjointed, but there's something about the approach to writing this novel that, as you pointed out, always refers those things back to climate. And so like, especially earlier in the book, there'll be a lot of times where we don't talk about climate directly, like in an episode. And yet there's going to be a point in which probably Emily, because she's better at this than I am, will like refer it back to climate. And I think that says something about the novel and says something good about the novel.
It was always already climate.
But yeah, the ambition and the scope of this book, I think, recommends it, and also recommends podcasting about it. You pointed out all the different genres that it might be, and like I just made a little list. It's climate fiction, political thriller, dystopia, metafiction, speculative fiction, mystery, epic, nature writing, satire, adventure, tragedy, addiction novel, campus novel, post-college malaise novel. Did I miss anything?
No, I don't. I mean, probably, but also no. Yeah.
Exactly.
And that's the beauty of it. Yeah.
So we'll keep track of themes and narrative. That'll probably be the longest part of each episode.
I think so.
I imagine, just because it's a book that's doing a lot of things. But we'll do some other segments throughout the way, Emily. We're gonna pair each chapter with one or more cultural artifacts, right? A book, a piece of music, a piece of film, a television show, another novel, so on and so forth, that we think fits with each chapter. And maybe this is a place in this prologue episode for us about why we're two political scientists, political theorists doing a podcast about a cultural text.
Well, John, so glad you asked. In part, it's because we already podcast. So yes. We have the habit is well built, well established. Yes. Yeah. We podcasted together as graduate students in the CUNY Graduate Center Political Science PhD program. Yeah.
And here's where Emily plugs her podcast, her other podcast, and I plug my other podcast.
Perfect. Yeah. I also work on a podcast called Stuck in Stony Brook, which is a podcast about the Babysitters Club, where myself, my aunt, and my aunt's childhood best friend, all reread the books we loved as children from our respective adult expertise lenses. So it is a books podcast, and we did pull a little of structure from that podcast in coming up with the conceit for this podcast, but just a bit.
Yeah, just a bit. It's a great podcast. Highly recommend. Endorse.
Have you read The Babysitter's Club?
I don't think so.
You know who was a guest on our podcast is Danielle Hanley.
Yeah.
Who is also.
Yeah, Danielle Hanley is my primary co-host over on Not Quite Great Books, a TV podcast, which is a podcast primarily about the TV show The Americans, which is a spy thriller set in the Washington, D.C. metro area in the 80s, as it tracks a family of KGB sleeper agents who are fully undercover as Americans, the titular Americans. But it's also a show that is about love and marriage and nationalism and loyalty and secrecy and the family and the institutional politics and music and culture of the 80s and the vibes of the 80s. So we try to track all of that. We've covered some other shows on that podcast, primarily the Pope verse, Young Pope, New Pope, bonkers shows that are loved. But so Emily and I are well versed in we can never fully turn the like poli-sci political theory brains off.
Sure can.
But we can incorporate them into podcasting about cultural texts, which is a thing that we've both come to love, I think.
And we love very ambitious takes that are tenuously connected to the source material.
I mean, there's few things I love in life more than that.
We also have historically, the podcast has been generative for us as scholars. We worked on the Always Already podcast together with a bunch of our grad school colleagues. During grad school, it still exists, but it's in a sort of latent transition phase, maybe, is a way of thinking about it.
Definitely.
But a lot of actually co-authored scholarship has come out of that. We have written a few pieces with our colleague Rachel Brown on sort of like political theories of work and labor, which came out of a discussion of a text that we did on our critical theory podcast. So the goal with this podcast was maybe we will write something, but who knows? Yeah.
Who knows? Yeah. But the podcast first. It's more fun. And we'll do a lot more thinking and a lot more free ranging thinking in the podcast form.
Committing ideas to the record. So
yeah. And it's public scholarship, right? At least that's what I'm going to put on my fucking CV.
Yeah. That's already on mine because beautiful. Okay. One thing we're also going to do is, in true political theory fashion, read each chapter through a theorist or with a theorist, alongside a theorist, in tension with a theorist, insert spatial metaphor for what theory is.
Exactly.
And that is what we will do. So just briefly here, our own theory relationships to this book. I wrote a dissertation looking at trying to bring basically kind of like feminist science studies and environmental political theory together through the lens of like how we talk about climate change. So I tried to think about the politics of climate change denial as a kind of like politics of epistemology, and think through the resources that feminist science studies offers us for trying to understand what happens when we argue about the science of climate change. It was an overly ambitious dissertation that I finished in a rush.
All of them are that too.
Yeah. And I haven't quite gone back to it in a way that I had wanted to. But when I read this book, it struck me as this incredibly ambitious book that I was shocked that somebody wrote. And also I had so much dissertation PTSD reading it. And a couple chapters in particular really were like, wow, if I had done this if I had written my dissertation for 12 years, I could never even have like distilled the thing that I was trying to talk about in such clear and like casual prose. So it was impressive to me, not just as a novel, but its relationship to the things that I like, the threads of political theory and of philosophy and of like women, gender and sexuality studies that I've always been really interested in, that it engages, were just like huge for me.
Absolutely. So occasionally, I have no doubt, I will be clearing out for some office hours with Dr. Crandall, who has, more expertise. And in some ways, I think my theory relationship is a little bit different in that it's only in the past, like, let's say 3 years or so, that I've started teaching more classes in environmental political thought, environmental ethics, and like this climate politics and fiction and film class, in which I taught the Deluge last semester, which no doubt I will refer to way too many times over the next, many dozen episodes of this podcast.
I mean,
and this is our own version of I'm going to write the 900-page climate novel. Is we're going to make a chapter by chapter podcast about that. Well, that's our version of it. But I'm thinking a lot about
up for like a year.
I mean, more than that. Try 2 years. At least of episode releases, if not recording time. But I will. I will be thinking about this a lot through like how have I taught and thought about what it means to like do teaching in environmental politics and related fields, like to students who oftentimes have a lot of either, I think, conscious or less than conscious climate anxiety and like a little bit of nihilism, which I don't, which is not to neg at all. Like I in some ways I support that, but I think there are a lot of questions that this book raises about what does it mean to live a life, to have a life project, and to like try to seek out some kind of agency, human agency, individually and collectively, or some kind of forms of solidarity in response to climate, while everyone like has their day-to-day bullshit of life within some characters and varying levels of I am thinking about climate all of the time. And I think that the fact that there are characters who fit in differently on those various spectrums makes this a really useful book for thinking about like politics of everyday life and also like grand scale climate politics. So I'll be trying to pay attention to that.
And I think we will pay a lot of attention.
Yes.
Inevitable. As we sit sweating the hottest summer of our lives, but that is the coldest summer of the future of our rest of our lives.
I've started multiple classes with that Simpsons meme of like the map of this is, the hottest summer ever. And then Homer's like, it's the coldest summer the rest of your life. So I hear you.
It's appropriate and relevant, dear listener, to the book. So stay tuned.
Yes.
Our last segment is what we're referring to as the millennial comedy segment, which, John, this really came from your teaching experience.
I think this book is really hilarious. On a like line by line joke writing level at points, but more so like as a kind of general vibe or a comedic aesthetic. But as I discovered in teaching this novel to a bunch of students, most of whom were between the ages of 18 and 22, with one student who was 30, that the comedy doesn't quite work for them the way it does for me. And part of that is that I had already read the novel, so I could pay a little more attention to the prose itself. And also because one of my many takes is that the comedy in this novel is extremely millennial coded, and extremely like bougie intellectual millennial coded. One of my favorite lines in the book involves like who gets the last hummus in the store. And I'm into that kind of humor. So this book is dark and intense, but there's also like a surprising amount of humor and levity in it. And we're going to pay attention to that as two millennials who are, I'm Markley's like 40 or 41. I'm 37 as of recording this, and Emily's a couple of years younger than that. So I'll
be 36 soon.
Yeah. So congratulations.
What temporality?
Exactly.
We don't know.
When is this being released versus
when are we writing this book? Yeah,
exactly. A classic question. A classic question in this novel. So I think this is a funny novel. I believe Emily also finds this to be a humorous novel.
I was surprised to hear that your students did not find it as funny. So I was like, absolutely, we have to track the comedy. So my marginal notes will be LOLs.
Great. All of this is happening with a frankly wild structural conceit in honor of Markley's frankly wild structural conceit.
Yeah. So there are 6 points of view.
Yes.
In the novel. Each book contains one chapter from each point of view.
Yes.
They all are, each book is sort of like the same timeline, but they're not written in the same year necessarily.
Precisely.
And then as it moves forward in time, they're not in the same order. But each character has a very different writing style, a different vibe, a different aesthetic.
Yeah.
So
different genre.
Different genre. Yeah.
Different form. Yeah.
So much meta commentary. It's great.
I love it.
So
you will too, listener, we promise.
Very ambitiously trying to adopt a different form per each POV.
Yes.
So, for example, in the character Shane, which you will be introduced to in a few episodes, Shane is probably I'm going to have a hard time with the cryptic foreshadowing balance in this endeavor. But Shane is a non-political activist and like a non-institutional political actor.
Brilliant.
Right?
Brilliantly said.
So we're going to attempt to do Shane's POV in the form of a political manifesto.
Yes. We have Ashir Al-Hassan, who starts out working outside of government. He is a forecaster, a modeler, and will eventually find his way into government. All his chapters are written in the form of reports, either to himself, like for the record, to himself as a kind of mental health exercise, or to specific actors, people, characters, institutions, so on and so forth. And so we will follow Markley's lead, writing Ashir, and all of our Ashir chapters will be presented in the form of a report.
We also have Jackie, who is a marketing
guru, hotshot.
Yes. So
girl boss.
She's girl boss. She
starts questionable girl boss.
Yeah. She starts just like getting an entry-level job in marketing and becomes an exec later on. So her trajectory is interesting. The politics of it, we're going to also try to track. So we're going to try to do Jackie chapters in the form of a pitch deck, which is probably the least true to form, given that we just Googled some words that are things in a pitch deck and then tried to match them to our our segments. But I think we're going to have a lot of fun with it. We like the idea of playing on business jargon speech, but also don't really know that much. So I think it's going to probably be the most amusing for us. And who knows if you will find it amusing, dear listener.
Yeah. And it's also hopefully a little bit of like a self-own, because, you know, we've been known to use insidery theory jargon in our day-to-day lives, our writing, maybe our podcasting. So we're also hopefully poking a little fun at ourselves. Yeah. We have the chap with a character of Keeper. Keeper lives in Ohio, like kind of like Dayton, Columbus area of Ohio, is in and out of addiction and recovery, I think maybe we can say, without saying much more about Keeper. And all of those chapters from Markley are written 100% in the second person. And one of the defining factors of the Keeper chapters are that it's often a kind of jumbled stream of consciousness with some intention on the writer part, at least. And so we are going to try to mirror that and have our own stream of consciousness episodes with Keeper. And as he undergoes some transformations later on in the book, is that fair to say? Yes. We might try out some other forms with Keeper.
But those we will not name. We also have Matt, who is a good old boy from North Carolina who strikes out west in search of excitement and something to write about. And he meets Kate, who is a huge looming figure in the novel. And we'll talk a lot about why the dynamic between her centrality to the overall plot and him being the narrator of sort of her existence, her relevance, her political development, all that stuff. And with Matt, we're going to do like a play on a kind of long form journalist article. He's the one who's like documenting what's happening, and
in a writerly way.
Yeah. And John's hot take is that probably Matt is our closest sub-in for Markley himself.
Yes.
Which is a take that we will subject to scrutiny. Yeah.
We've also got Tony, our final sixth point of view character, Tony Petrus. He is, at the beginning of the novel, an academic, an oceanographer, climate scientist, doing some climate modeling of methane clathrates and how these kind of methane compounds in the ocean will affect the course of temperature and climate in the years to come. And at the same time, he experiences some kind of catalyzing personal events in the first chapter that set him on a slightly different course. And so we'll track that. But as an academic, true to our hearts, Tony many episodes we will do in the form of an academic article. We had to do it.
It is ambitious when we lay it out.
Yes, but we promise all of those different forms, all the different kinds of episodes will contain all those elements you just heard us talk through the podcast about. There'll be an episode title, summary and plot and character, themes, narrators, reactions, cultural artifact, theory, and comedy. They'll all be in all of the main episodes.
Yes.
Just in a different order.
They'll have different names.
And have different names each time.
There are also these very interesting interludes in each book, some of which are sort of like news articles, some are collections of headlines. So we're going to do interlude episodes to keep on with the sort of meta mirror of the form of the novel itself. So those will be shorter episodes where we just sort of do a bit or a kind of reaction to what it is that those interludes are doing is something we'll track to in terms of like overall questions around form and then the sort of politics of those interludes as well.
There are going to be so many bits in this podcast.
A lot of bits. Yeah. We love a bit.
We love a bit. And you, hopefully, dear listener, will love a bit as well.
Yeah. So please read along if you haven't or don't, and just come hang out and listen to us riff on 900 pages of a climate change behemoth.
Behemoth. Yes. I wasn't sure if you were going epic, Leviathan, or Behemoth. I was going to say Leviathan, but that felt too on the nose. Yes, and we should shout out our music for this podcast is the song I Can't See the Milky Way Anymore by one of my students, Alex Rudnick. They are in a post-punk band here in Plattsburgh, New York, and they make some post-punk music on their own. So we have an instrumental piece from Alex Rudnick to accompany us.
It's great.
We hope you listen. It'll be a good time. It'll be a time.
I think it's going to be a great time.
I think it's going to be a great time for us, Emily. There's no doubt about that.
Anything else?
No, I think that's about all we wanted to say about this podcast.
Great.
And stay tuned for Tony Chapter 1, first full episode of this show here.
Beautiful. Thank you for tuning in to We Are The Deluge.
And as we'll say every episode, we are the deluge.